Happy National Poetry Month, and welcome to the launch of Flying Yellow, new and selected poems by Suzanne Underwood Rhodes. We're so happy to have you with us today. I'd like to ask everyone to take a moment to find the chat bar and the Q&A button, or the option to raise your hand, because after the reading today, there will be a chance for some questions and conversation with Suzanne. We're also streaming live on Facebook, and a recording of the launch will be available on YouTube a little later on today. If you registered for today's launch, you'll receive a follow-up email with information about the recording and also a special coupon code that you can use if you order the book from Paraclete Press. Now I'd like to introduce our poet. Suzanne Underwood Rhodes lives, writes, and teaches in the mountains of Fayetteville, Arkansas, and is the author of a poetry collection, What a Light Thing, This Stone, and 2 chapbooks. Her poems were nominated for the Pushcart Prize and have appeared, as well as her essays, in numerous journals and anthologies. Rhodes teaches poetry workshops at the Muse Writers Center in Virginia and for other groups of students ages 5 through 80. Her new collection that we are celebrating today is Flying Yellow. And I'll just tell you a few things that other poets are saying about Suzanne and her work. Bruce Guernsey, the author of From Rain, said, "Reader, beware, for Flying Yellow is not an easy path to follow. Rhodes is a deeply spiritual terrain, a book of many journeys with a voice who leads us like Dante's, meeting us in the deep woods with no way to know what will lead us out. In these dark times, these poems of journey and survival are the flying yellow day we need." Jill Baumgartner said, "This is one of the richest poetry collections I have read in a long time. These poems excite the spirit with revelations of the holy that one encounters in the most unlikely places, which of course is where the holy often appears." Sophia Starnes, another Paraclete poet, said, "Rhodes gathers up things alongside the absence of things in a defiant affirmation of blessedness. By the time we arrive at the closing poem, we know we have been offered something akin to the gold of afterlife, a God-infused reality, at times sorrowful, yet forever redeemed. Flying Yellow is salvific poetry at its most reverent, a crucial, blessed antidote for our irreverent world." If you have a copy of the book in your hands, you'll see many, many more beautiful words about Suzanne and her poetry. So without further ado, welcome, Suzanne. Congratulations on this beautiful, beautiful book.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you for hosting this book launch that I've been looking forward to for a long time. Your words are very gracious and I appreciate them. And I also want to express my deep appreciation for all the Paraclete people, because you all have been tremendously supportive and caring, and your standards of excellence are just so admirable, and also your pursuit of beauty and truth that is evident in the books that you bring to life. So thank you for your part in this.
Thank you. It's our absolute pleasure. Suzanne, I would love to, again, just sort of take a few minutes for our attendees. I'm sure many of them know you, but for those who don't know you, just to get to know you a little bit more here today. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about your life and poetry, and especially when and why did you start writing poetry?
Thank you for the question. That's a good one. I started writing when I was 6 years old, my first poem. And I also wrote a little story that my mother, who herself was a writer and a great inspiration in my life, she took my story and she typed it up. It was called Old Bones, about a horse. And she typed it up on very good bond paper and sent it to the Atlantic Monthly, which, as you can imagine, that was a huge boost to my confidence that, wow, I could reach for something like that, which is really sweet. And then I had, besides my mother, I had teachers all along the way who saw something in me and encouraged me to write, which I have done all my life. The first poem I wrote, I mentioned earlier, but it was called The Secret Stream. And it was pretty much a bad poem, a piece of doggerel, but not too long ago, I looked at that poem again and I realized that it really holds the qualities of the imaginative life, especially for me, and I hope I speak for others as well, but that imaginative life involves being called away from the world to a very private and silent space. For me, it was the silence of God. And also the metaphor of water, the secret stream, the water that's ever flowing, that represents the inner life, communion with God, and then this childlike sense that everything is possible in the imagination and dream. And my first grade teacher, Mrs. Kolasek, Ashland Elementary School in Arlington, Virginia, she gave me this little book to write my verses in. She said, because you like poetry. And so until I was about, you can see my childish scrawl, until I was about 13, I would put all my poems in there. So that was really great. And the other thing I think is kind of interesting is that at a very young age, I recognized that poetry was the vehicle for carrying my deepest thoughts and feelings. That secret stream of the imagination inside each person, and especially the artist, is to be guarded as inviolable and really precious, because I think we have to really protect the inner life from the pollutants, especially for the artist, the creative life, from pollutants like apathy, which can be very present in this pandemic age, but also things like competitiveness, political rant. These are some of the spoilers, being trendy, things like that. And I think it's like the love we have for someone, we care for them, we're protective of them. And ultimately, writing poetry for me is an act of love.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I know that Flying Yellow isn't your first book of poetry. You have so many beautiful collections and your chapbooks and your poetry and essays that have been published all over. And it's interesting that you're talking about yourself as a child, because that little line in your bio about all of the students that you've taught from young to old, I imagine all of those are factors that have shaped your career as a writer and a poet. Is that true? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mentioned, my mother, who was my mentor and a cheerleader, she herself was a writer. And she read to us when we were small children. And then in school, elementary school, we read wonderful books like Mary Poppins and Kon-Tiki, Charlotte's Web, Mr. Popper's Penguins. I'm just kind of popping here today. I should mention another influence is my sister Leslie, who a year older, we were 1 year and 1 day apart, our birthdays. And Leslie has been my most enthusiastic reader and appreciative reader. A listener audience of my poems. And she always lets me interrupt her, and did when we were young. Whatever she was doing, she would let me interrupt her to read one of my poems. So I really appreciate her. But then reading has been a huge part of my life. It nurtures the mind and the spirit. And as I mentioned, I've had those teachers, also colleagues and other poets. So it's amazing how throughout my life, it's like God gave me a gift, and then he gave me people along the way to encourage and help develop that gift. And because I've been given so much, I want to be able to give back to others. As you mentioned, I love teaching. I love seeing the potential in aspiring writers, and doing these workshops has been great. And so I also have a small editing practice, and that's another way that I can teach, is through editing book manuscripts. So the other thing I thought I might mention is that in my poems, the things that I pursue most ardently is the music of language, the sound associations, the rhythms. That's so critical to my writing, as well as the power of imagery and the power of story. And I think you'll see those elements in my reading. Mhm.
For sure. After reading Flying Yellow, I feel like I got to know you and
Mhm.
see some of the things that really capture your eye and your heart. But I would love to hear you talk about what you would say are the major themes of your poetry, or what are the special interests that you have that inspire you and kind of shine through your words.
Mm. Well, the book is divided into 4 sections, and I think those represent the themes. The first one has to do with family history and
Mm,
blood ties, because we're so shaped by the influences of our family members, for good and bad as well.
mhm.
And the second section explores characters who intrigue and fascinate me. Some of these are real and some are imagined. Some of them come from literature and history, but I love to write persona poems and kind of take on the soul of others. Um, and then in the third section, the poems are about the created world, the world of creatures and landscapes. There's a strong sense of place in my work.
Mm.
Um, and I love being outdoors, and especially do I love birds. And I study them obsessively. I used to listen to tapes of the bird calls, and I have the distinction of having been named the poet laureate of the Bristol Bird Club when I lived in Bristol, Tennessee.
I love
Uh,
that.
yeah. So those are, oh, and then the last section are the more directly religious poems, you might say,
Mhm.
that are expressions of um, biblical stories, as well as my own Christian faith and questions too.
Thank you. I was just trying to find it. Now, of course, I can't because I didn't mark it. That was foolish of me. But I'm thinking about the poem for which the collection is named. And what does Flying Yellow mean? And why did you choose that title to sort of represent the whole collection here?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, because I've been chewing on that myself ever since I titled the book that. But yeah, I think Flying Yellow has to do with that which is beyond human knowledge. It has to do with intuition, with the life of the spirit, with the body and what the body knows and understands. And I think also it's the pull of heaven, which
Mm.
is a very strong theme in my book. And in fact, I think it's the light of God, the lavish light and love of God that is kind of a threads throughout the collection. And I see it as something yellow and shining.
I love that. Thank you. Um, Suzanne, are there specific events in your life and at this point in your career that led to the birth of this collection of Flying Yellow?
Yes, I would start with the joyful things. I have a wonderful husband in my second marriage who's just brought me a lot of peace and happiness into my life. I have 3 children who are so precious to me, all of them very talented, all of them in love with words as I am.
Hmm.
And then, of course, I always mention my mother. Her name is Mary Lee. She was Mary Lee. She was married 3 different times, widowed, and then remarried a third time. But there are also the sorrowful events in my life. I was the child of divorce when my father left us for another woman when I was very young. And then my mother remarried back in the 50s. It was really hard to raise 3 little children and have enough money, to have a job where you could make enough money to support them. So her life was pretty rough, and she made a pretty poor choice in her second marriage. My stepfather was an emotionally crippled man who also was abusive. And my mother actually left him 3 different times,
Hmm.
but always went back. And then other sorrows more recently were a cancer diagnosis and the treatment, that was kind of rough that followed that. And then some pretty terrible family tragedies. So, it's both it's the bittersweet life that we all walk through.
Absolutely. Suzanne, I would love to ask you to read some of your poems for us today. And I want to turn off my camera and my voice so that everyone attending can really have a chance to just sort of immerse themselves in your words. So if you're willing, I'll disappear. We'd love to
Okay.
hear you.
Thank you. All right, well, I'll start with a poem about my mother called My Mother Haunts the Thrift Store. When I saw the glint of her French hoop earrings as she lighted the steps of the bus taking her downtown to a job that stoked my stepfather's ire, her ponytail high and swinging, the envy of the other college office girls, saw the ghost of those hoops in the cracked display case of pop beads and bangles, and the same cloisonné heart given her by my sister who sleeps far away, but weeps in faded pages of my mother's journal. And then down the aisles, rack after rack, the coral, the aqua, the striking white on black. Color was her flair, her strong opinions shaming pale shirts of thought, but oh, what heads she turned with those colors. When I passed the books packed tight on sinking shelves and spied among the hot-throated covers of cheap paperbacks, biographies of John Adams and Charlemagne, a King James Bible, Truman Capote novels following her through many moves and 2 dead husbands to feed her restless mind, the mind that fed me too, all the way back to gypsies and poets singing in books she read to me in sheltered spaces. When I came to the shoes, high heels announcing her long, shapely legs, those suede shoes I longingly brushed as she dressed for an evening out, the complex glamour of her French twist and mystical air of Chanel No. 5, the sorrow of her true red lipstick. All this transfixed me with the force of a dream I still reach for, and even the linens, the sheets and spreads bleached clean of love and death speak of her body so present in everything given away. Next, I'll read How the Dress Lived. And there's an epigraph from Carl Jung that says, the creative mind plays with the objects it loves. Like my mother, I unmade clothes to make them. It was a war between rules and resistance to see how far we could get before conceding in the face of the wrong pocket to the pattern's authority. For us, the making was all in the feeling, the sewing from senses. I'd pin my moth-thin pattern to the fabric cut from a big starchy bolt that landed with a thump on the counter. The salesgirl in glasses with a head for math unrolled the reams of cloth and snipped my yards and a half with her expert scissors, its bite releasing denim's blue stiffness, organza's gauzy pools. And then to go home and lay out my fabric, seeing myself as the butterick girl sketched with goddess curves in the dress I was sewing in colors of gold or teal to complement my hair. To set up the singer with its pinpoint light, work the pedal, train the spool's thread to the bobbin, thrumming ever faster as I thought of my dress, how gorgeous I'd be, like the girls at school in stylish clothes from Garfinkel's. No, prettier, Mom would say, as she stood me on a chair to rehem a skirt, trusting her eye, not the tape measure, with straight pins like defiant little spears between her lips as she tugged and tucked, nodding yes to the girl of her birthing, cut from her own unruly swath to suit the shapes, dreams, colors of her mind. I remember one dress, a skirt that she made, the hem was like really cockeyed. The next poem I'm going to read is called The Caricaturist. My stepfather was an artist and he worked for the CIA. He also did a lot of caricatures, political stuff, and he just had a knack for capturing those essential lines. The Caricaturist. My first death, I was riding in the back seat of the Buick Special, studying my stepfather's neck with its stitchwork of lines, when over the wind's rush from the downed windows, he announced, "Bill Fetters is dead." My comic book slid from my lap because all I could think of was Mr. Fetters sticking his hand in that fan at my parents' party and blood flying around the room and Daddy explaining it was for laughs, the crazy SOB, and now he was saying he died of a pickled liver. I pictured the poor gasping fish and turned to drown my face in wind. What parties? They danced and drank in the basement with its pole jacking up the house to the throb of jazz on the hi-fi, a haze of cigars and cocktail dresses, my mother with her chic French twist, men with loose ties, and laughter roaring through the vents, the adults in their fugitive world, and me and my sisters and ours, free until 2 a.m. when the house came back from the party and shrank to our dining room table with its crack between leaves, where Daddy nailed his fools with a genius art, knew their true colors with a devil's eye. Secretly, I tried to let them out, poking at my lima beans to offer Bill a backbone, Fritz hair, me a slim body. Light, a little more light in the lead gray room where Mommy was always excusing losers when his words were stripping us, smiting the helpless lines. She tried to make peace, a thin, watery soup, not good for much, but more than the ashes that came of his scorn, a scar deeper than any I owned. Poetry is a way of discovery, of getting insight. And this next poem I'm going to read was a digging down deep to find a place of forgiveness for my stepfather. And this is called Onions. The ground is winter, though the day is March. In one hand, seeds, in the other, a trowel, because when your father is dying, you're going to plant onions in frozen dirt. Onions make sense in a time of coma. Stab the dirt, claw it, stab and claw the cold riddle begun in violence when you were small, that you papered over, hoping to hide from the others, fool them in motley layers of self. No one could know what was down there below, quivering a naked snail. And he wasn't even your true father. But keep digging past every bitter loss, and maybe you'll find it's really God under the sheets, and your father, his heart crushed, sleeps forgiven. Well, I'm going to lighten up a little bit and read a poem that I wrote on the occasion of my daughter Katie's 40th birthday last year. And this is called A Bird's Eye Birthday for Katie. Did you hear the cardinal today? The first trill after many tuneless months? You know he keeps a song under his royal red cloak to pull out on your birthday with spring on the wing. He spied your face, pretty as the sun, showing up in the yard with your boy who hops about like a rabbit. And out of the king's heart flew purdy, 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 3 notes to count like cardinal numbers. He sang to the light in your hair and to your hands dancing on the run. He sang to the work you left on your desk along with bills, which oddly have no bills, and to laundry unfolded and pots in the sink, 6 books to read, a sorrow to soothe. He sang to your smile and the Lord's smile shining on the cows in the field behind the house and on the chittering sparrows and distant coyotes. But mostly he sang to your face shining in the eye of your mate who loves you, a mate with strong good looks, but not to his trophies, the deer mounts. He sang to your mother and her red hair to which he is partial, and to the red squirrels fattened on corn, to the pair of cats and their dog who warms them at night, to the stars nesting in heaven he sang, and sings of the seasons that were and are to come, and of the happy day you were born, carried by a breeze to the ground you stand on now, and not a single feather to show for it. I like sometimes to tuck little jokes into my poems. The next poem is about my grandmother, Nettie Pearl Robinson. She was a farmer, lived in rural northern Alabama. And after she died, my mom and sister went to her house in Falkville, Alabama. And, a lot of my poems are inspired by images that just sort of shimmer, kind of can't go away. They last. And the image that I had as we were leaving her home after the funeral, after taking care of some business matters, was this forsythia bush that was just shooting out spears of yellow flames. And it was so beautiful. It was on a spring day. And so when I got home, I wrote this poem. It's called Nettie. She went out in Forsythia, a yellow day bursting over fields once ablaze with corn and cotton, over the road buried in asphalt that leveled it, but it's still breathing underneath, pure dirt, hard as a laborer's back, a road that follows the earth's curve. The tall weeds walk up and down, singing alongside, and I was the girl walking with them, telling stories to the wind. Strange I wasn't sadder. Grandma's laughter was always wanting out, teased her mouth into a grin, but had to hold itself in for the worrisome times, and she could worry better than anyone in Morgan County. Storms, the boys running moonshine, Aunt Mattie going blind, and my mother, the beauty among brothers with fire in her mind. That morning was the last time I breathed the simple air. There's no one left to pick the small, sweet jewels of time, strawberries from her garden. I mentioned that I'm fascinated by different personalities, and I like to write persona poems. So this character named Sister Sophia presented herself to me and asked to be created. And so I wrote this poem. It was W.H. Auden who said, "Poetry is the clear expression of mixed feelings," and I think this applies to Sister Sophia. Sister Sophia's Quarrel. What would I be if a poem born of my flesh should escape? A fish-stinking clump of words drawn from a vexed inward sea. I'll never allow it. My rogue pen might abhor rules, but I rule it within the greater order. Like the liturgy of the hours, so must my words keep faith, walk meekly within their lines, be clean as cups on the shelf. Though Sister Ruth seems always to miss the subtle tea stains, as she at prayer is also often missing. She calls herself a poet, and knowing of my verse, appeared last night at my cell, flush-faced, fluttering. Oh, sister, permit me to read these lines. They came to me unbidden and in a white heat. Forgive my great impudence, but see how I tremble to tell you the Spirit said the poem is for you. Imagine the crumb telling the loaf how to be bread. She pressed on with her shocking verse. Better honey from the rock than the rock. Better to sin, bless his wounds, than be safe. Think of the one who spurned men's commands and let a whore perfume and adore him with passionate hair, who stretched out his hand to bloom a stump, on a Sabbath at that, and in the presence of clergy. And then she hurried out, but not before leaving with words that worried me all night like a mouse gnawing inside a wall. It's true, Sister Sophia. Art is strict as the honeycomb, but wild as love, the ecstatic honey. You may know about Jean-Paul Sartre's conversion when he was old, blind, on his deathbed, and how his friend Pierre Victor, aka Benny Levy, was his confessor, and Victor recorded words that Sartre spoke at the end, and I love this. Sartre said, "I do not feel that I am the product of chance, a speck of dust in the universe, but someone who was expected, prepared, prefigured." This is called Someone Who Was Expected. I was there when a boy saw his shadow for the first time spilling out of himself like another boy. He waved to his mother, it's me," and danced from boy to boy on the moon-white lawn. Blind Sartre, too, saw himself for the first time. A hand, was it a shadow of his own? Or was his the shadow, the allegory, that hand descending and death in the room waiting with the patience of Job? He felt his useless eyes waken, scan the room for his friend, old rebel turned Jew, who'd been keeping watch but was out for a smoke when the hand swept in like a force to show the exit. Self-knowledge, pure being beloved, and Sartre, lucid to the end, knew it was so. The air surged with sense, incense. I'll read a few of my poems that are deeply rooted in place, in natural spaces. This is called There's the Lake and There's the Street. Excuse me. This was inspired by a kayaking trip with my husband Wayne at Stumpy Lake in Virginia Beach. We left the street for the timeless green lens of water. The only signposts were cypress trees with fluted dresses who danced when our heads were turned, the way trees in love dance everywhere, who led us to longer and farther reaches of silence, past the turtle's head, the egret's curve, our paddles resting across our laps as villages of knobs drifted by on their way to the sun's slow commerce, past the water strider's elegant script and our need for words, for memory. We held it the whole afternoon, that enchanted face, then let it slip into the water. We had so many places we loved in the Virginia Beach area, and the watery landscapes. I'll read one where we would, it's called The Weight of Less Light. We lived in an apartment close to the beach, and behind our apartment was a gorgeous park. It was called Salt Meadow Bay, where we lived. And we walked there just about every day. And this is called The Weight of Less Light. Summer's late blooms sink in sunlight, as if a hand were herding us through time, down to the cricket, wee clock in the grass, to the water snake sleek among rocks, tuned to the tide and the rush of fish in brackish brown, and soon called away, to the toothless man on a bench and his bearded friend, both old, grown older, and tired from weather, down to the squirrel and her frenzied hunt, to the grasshopper dragging itself in the dirt, to the last blackbird flown from the marsh, a red smear of wings, a cry to pierce the heart. Down to the moon, that white drum above us, drumming our blood and the seasons inside. Already the sea oats bend low, pressed down by the weight of less light and the shadow of a great invisible. I want to read a poem I wrote about my husband and a trip we took to Assateague Island. If I can find it here. It is on page 27 here. Okay, it's called White Music at Dusk. And I don't know if you can see behind me, this is the picture that Wayne took of the egret that I wrote about in the poem, White Music at Dusk. An egret preens in a tree backlighted by the pendant sun, slipping to gild each strand, and you catch it on film, the royal bird, the branch, before the world goes dark. We ride our bikes home past the grave blank sea, past years when I never knew how to picture my life. But here the pine-strewn path in low light returns the day's honey to my mind, gold in the branches, the rinsed air, the thought of you holding my face as your brightest world. And now I'll read Flying Yellow, since we've talked about that a bit. This was, I was going through chemotherapy, and we took a little getaway trip near Charlottesville, Virginia, in the mountains, and we were taking a hike around Sharonda Lake. Flying Yellow. Following, then losing the leaf gold trail, I have no way to know if up will lead us out. We see only downward, and down is deep. I'm questioning my footfall and lean against my stick. You've gone ahead to test the ground. This body, not used to weakness, feels alone. It's a person in its own right, wanting to bless the mind, slipping on scree to say, trust the light, but the mind shuts its ears, knows better than that foolish, stricken body, and couldn't catch the flying yellow day if it tried. When I had my first chemotherapy treatment, this wonderful friend and priest named Father Nigel came into the treatment room, and this is what he did. Priest in the treatment room for Father Nigel Mumford. Drowsed with potions, we had our fun as the shrill signals waned, and we slipped deeper into our plush recliners, glad to be sleeping with disease at bay, to have thoughts teased from us drip by drip, the faces of son or sister dim despite the huge overbright room that out of nowhere welcomed a priest riding in a scooter, a black-clad Jesus, but one laboring to breathe as he landed at someone's chair and blessed her bags hung from hooks, 3 bags of poison, blessed a head bent and scared against his hand. But oh, you knew he knew what it's like to be pitted against those stakes with all of us hoping on the skids. And this poem is called Cutting Hair. It's continuing a little bit about my journey. On the day to cut your hair, the sun has shaken its shaggy mane of light over the near ocean, over the trees behind our house after a night of hunting, after birds have refilled the trees and death has slipped into the deep woods, its memory scant as a snail's thread on the patio. I wrap you in a cape and snug it with a clip. How careful I must be, rounding your good ear with scissors, the ear my tongue loves to kiss, apricot sweet, and loves too the ear, the bad ear and its ghosts. I thread your hair with a comb to gauge length, silver in my loom. I cut your hair in rhythm, remembering the day you shaved what was left of mine, how we walked on a trail through the marsh, through tufts of fog, and I was slow as soup of low tide, slow against your arm, remembering what it was like not to lean, to be bright in my bones. I see light differently now, painting the branches behind our house, early before you're awake. It's more the gold of afterlife, I think, a glimpse before bodies take on all that death. I want to read 3 more poems. Thank you so much for coming and hearing my poems. It means a lot to me. This one is called Shirley Spaniel, and I'll have to look it up because I didn't write it down where it is. If you'll bear with me, please. Okay, I found it. Shirley Spaniel. To be a priest is to widen your arms, to hold the great sorrow, the stillborn hour, the hour night fell like a drunk along the canal, slipping into the black mouth of oblivion, and you laid your head on your arms to rest forever. But being a priest, you have to wake them up, those arms, and make them take heart for the ache of holding up a world small and trembling, full of fever or bone thin and silent as snow. Sometimes you hold so long, you become the other. Is it so? Is it possible? Shirley Spaniel took on her seizures, but one day missed the step and lost the field. The priest said it happens that love can grow so large, no life can hold it. First it seeps, then flows, then floods, and someone walks out, and someone disappears. The Anglican Communion has what they call a bidding prayer, and that's the name of this poem. And I've thought about all the different parts of people that are lost everywhere in the world. A bidding prayer for all the lost eyes and limbs wandering over there, the severed head that made Herodias smile, and each head that darkly soaks the dust, but once nestled near a mother's heart, her luscious breasts promising lasting, improbable love. For Robert Hanna's leg ripped with grape shot and his clumsy government issue stand-in, For soldiers like him blasted and sawn, their parts misplaced in foreign lands. For minds that never stop being killed. For Van Gogh's ear and his lost sanity spilling into zinnias. For poets charged with words and hung for words. For the honeycomb child dismembered from her dream, and what of her golden petaled parts? For grandfather's index finger tapping a tune over there, for my missing breast so lately fondled. Over there in the country of heaven, the body most broken, most whole, carries the sad, unbearable bones until they're all gathered home. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's really beautiful. Father Nigel is here, so I'm sure he loved hearing that. And Katie is here too, obviously. So special
Yes.
poems for people.
Blessings to
Thank
both.
you. A reminder to people to feel free to use the Q&A button or the chat bar to submit questions. And if you're ready, Suzanne, here's a question from Katie. Speaking of Katie, she says, guarding and protecting our secret stream in imagination is so important. What types of specific things would you recommend to help nurture and protect this precious asset?
Prayer is key. I didn't even mention that, but I feel that the Holy Spirit is truly alongside me and is part of poetry in my life. So prayer is a way of giving that to God and asking him to keep me pure in my thoughts and in my heart. Also, I think finding quiet places like being outside in the outdoors in nature is a really good way to pull away from the world and to be careful about what we take into our mind and heart. We are in the world, but we're not of the world. And not everybody, is a believer. I think protecting the creative space is important for all people who nurture their own imaginations and their artistic life. And so, yeah, they too, everyone should be careful with the way we live our lives. How we live our days is how we live our lives, Annie Dillard said. So we should live with integrity and, honesty and a love for what's beautiful and meaningful.
Thank you. Nigel asks, how can we unlock our mind and heart to access such depth? Your advice.
Being a good listener, being able to listen and to take people into our hearts and to respect and value them. What was the question again?
How can we unlock our mind and heart to access such depth?
Through great art, great books, literature, poetry, music, all those things feed us and take us deeper down. There's so many poems that I've loved in my life that have just taught me and opened up more of my sight, my inner sight. So I love in King Lear when Gloucester says, I see it feelingly. He had lost his eyes had been gouged out, and he's stumbling along in the wilderness and with Lear, and he says, I see it feelingly. And so I think we can ask God to give us more depth and to, reject the shallow things. I mean, it's okay to have fun and escape with recreation, but too much recreation, too much diversion, too many devices, too many screens, and all that can really make our brains shallow. In fact, there's a book called The Shallows. It's just about that, what the internet is doing to our brains. And for a little while, I tried to take your advice, but I really didn't get very far with that because I confess I too. But I do, when I write, I put all that away and I go into a kind of silence and I just listen I don't know in advance what I'm going to write. I feel like the ground of poetry is a sensory ground. So the more that we open up our senses to experience, to see better, to touch and feel, and you know, I've rescued little worms that are on the sidewalk, put them back in the grass so they won't dry out, and to notice specific things. I know my husband used to think all birds were sparrows, and he's a wonderful photographer. The picture behind me is the one he took, I mentioned. But you know, he's really into birds now and recognizes them, and so we have a lot of adventures together outdoors. I hope that answers the question okay.
Thank you. You tell so many personal stories through your poetry, and I hear and see a lot of bravery, because there's joy and there's sorrow and there's some rage, I would say, even. And there's one poem in particular that really caught my attention, which was the Raggedy Ann poem.
Ooh.
And I wondered if you would be willing to tell us about that one.
Shall I read it?
Sure, it's on page 46.
Thank you. Oh yeah, Raggedy Ann on God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a mask that I put on.
Mm.
Raggedy Ann, her heart is concealed under her clothes, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote this poem quite a while ago. Raggedy Ann on God. Oh God, who art a pushover, loves rubber babies or any clay soft tit adoring thing. Why have you forsaken me? Is it my arrow bones, the scars I see with? Go on, Daddy, try me. Stick your son like a gun in my ribs. It's flesh you smell, not wax. And believe me, mister, these wings are prayers, not pasteboard. I will claw your dimpled hands and rake your eyes and twist that plushy image like a dove's neck. I will not have you amused and babbling with your Play-Doh. I'm shaped too like a cross to let you off so easy. I was going through a period of searching in my own life, and I just felt that some of the representations of God, some of the sermons I heard were just so weak, so pasty, and I needed a God who understood what suffering was, because I had suffered a lot in my life as a child and growing up. And so that's the kind of God that I needed. And that's when I found, that Christ was one who understood suffering. He was acquainted with grief and bore, our sorrows, a man of sorrows. And so that's and it kind of has the lingo of a different era.
Yeah.
Go on, Daddy, try me.
Yeah.
But so that was, my Raggedy Ann poem.
It's one of the things that I think most of us respect most about poets is your willingness to work things out in front of everybody in a way and leave a record that helps other people, I believe, work through things too. So I thank you for that generosity.
And of course, the speaker of the poem is not necessarily the poet. Sometimes we confuse that, and
yes.
we have the otherness that we can
that's true
through our poems.
So true. Here's a question, Suzanne, from Catherine Irby. She says, as an elementary teacher, I loved sharing poetry with my students and encouraging them to write poetry. I used the metaphor of a bottle with them. I would tell them that a poem was like a bottle, which, when opened, let another person feel what you felt, and then it could be closed up to share again and again. Poetry helps me in my journey to be more understanding and compassionate. Thank you for opening your bottles today.
Lovely. Thank you. That's a wonderful analogy. I love that.
Me too. Oh, Nigel thanks you. He says you did answer his question very much.
Nigel himself is a very good poet, by the way. A wonderful writer.
There are many comments streaming in on the chat too. Suzanne, thanking you. I can't tell who this is from. I'm going to have to. Cynthia, thank you. Oh, your niece, perhaps.
Would I have time to read the poem that I wrote about Cynthia's brother, my nephew, or not?
Absolutely.
Because it's called A Fall Too Far. He loved U2. Is that the name of the group, the rock group? U2.
U2. Mm-hmm.
So that's referenced here. So there's an epigraph that explains the poem. Photographer Eric Paul Jansen died tragically on Monday afternoon at the age of 44. While taking photos, he fell from the 20th floor of the London House Hotel in Chicago, a skyscraper, to his death, and was just such a terrible tragedy. And I wrote this poem called A Fall Too Far. When you stepped out for the ultimate shot of the city's big shoulder, was it for yet another thrill to raise you farther from the pull of loves you couldn't keep? Just as you climbed into your room the night your mother died, the familiar YouTube poster and the edge to see you through, and the photo of her on your desk who gave you your blue eyes and height and never left St. Joseph's in your mind. I think, darling nephew, her words lived in you all the way through your costly slips and through your broken loves she held you, and from heaven where every sparrow's fall is marked, but how then could you fall so far? He and Cynthia lost their mother. He was 13 and she was 11, my sister, Robin. So that was a poem that I wrote with him in mind.
So beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do have time for a few more questions if anyone has them. Katie thanks you. Amazing poet
Katie.
and mama, she says.
Oh. She's a good one.
And Cynthia says she hadn't seen that. It's beautiful and she loves you. I'll save this chat bar that everyone's commenting in and I'll be sure you see it all, Suzanne.
Like, wish we were all together in person.
I know it's one of the mixed blessings of the pandemic is our discovery of Zoom and how it does enable us to connect, even though geographically we're far away from you. It's such a privilege and an honor to hear you speak your words and be able to celebrate this beautiful, beautiful collection with you.
Thank you.
I think that we may have come to the end of our questions. So I'll just thank you again so much, Suzanne, for entrusting us with your words. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Our celebration of National Poetry Month at Paraclete Press continues all month. Please take a peek at our website, paracletepress.com. For more online events. We have this launch opens our special month, and next week we'll be launching another new book by Kenneth Stephen, Iona. So that'll be a wonderful opportunity to hear from him. And if you follow Paraclete Poetry on Instagram, we have Instagram live events all month with Amy Bornman, Tanya Runyon, Christine Valters-Paintner, Scott Cairns, and Margaret Ingram. So I hope you'll be able to join us for some of those. Also, our 2021 Paraclete Poetry Prize is still open for submissions till May 1st, I believe, is the deadline. There's more information about that on our website too. So perhaps you too could join Suzanne as one of our honored Paraclete poets. Don't be shy, please send in your submissions. Flying Yellow and the entire Paraclete Poetry collection are available on our website, paracletepress.com, and at bookstores and online retailers everywhere. If your bookstore doesn't carry Flying Yellow, have them get in touch with Paraclete and we'll be happy to help them out. Oh, we always first say, please visit your local bookseller. So we mean it. And if they'd like to stock any of our titles, we love to help them out. Keep an eye out for the email you'll receive after the launch today for that coupon code. I see Katie posting things in the chat bar too, lots of links there. So take advantage of those, please. And I think that brings us to the end of our time together. Thank you again, Suzanne, so much. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Our prayers are with all of you for health and safety. And we wish you well. Take care. Thank you, Suzanne.
It's been really wonderful. Thank you.
Bye-bye.